Cold CEO went on a blind date for a friend but fell for a poor student at first sight. They told me the night would be ordinary, a little noisy café, a group of students squeezed into a corner, the kind of blind date that meant more chatter than chemistry. Lee had dragged me across campus with persuasive urgency and a dramatic flourish, like she was rescuing me from a weekend of ramen and bad coffee. I still remember the milk tea slipping from my hand the moment I walked in, a small, ridiculous disaster that splattered warm sweetness across the tablecloth and my own shoes. I froze, cheeks hot, reaching for napkins, and then the room blurred into a single, impossible face. He was not supposed to be the kind of person who noticed small things, like spilled drinks. He was the kind of person everyone noticed, composed, impeccably dressed, the kind of tall that made the crowd seem shorter by contrast. People said his smile was rare, and so was his patience. They called him cold because public appearances showed him that way, efficient, distant, untouchable. He was there to accompany a friend. The blind date was not for him. Yet he looked at me as if the room had quieted, as if the only sound left was the scrape of a napkin against cloth. I felt the ordinary thrum of my heart, too loud, too fast, like a drum out of sync. It sounds dramatic now, but in that moment, everything else drained in color. He caught my eye with the kind of steadiness that didn't ask for anything and somehow asked for everything. For the first time since I'd moved into this city to study, my breath snagged. It was not a cinematic lightning bolt. It was a slow, inevitable pull, like the tide pulling a paper boat toward shore. He didn't inflame the room with a grand gesture. He didn't sweep toward me on a wave of arrogance. He sat down, quiet as a shadow, and said, softly, almost like recognition, my name, Shajicha. Hearing it felt like a small unwrapping of possibility. I was embarrassed and ridiculous and aware of the way Lee's grin split her face, delighted at the chaos she'd engineered. He turned then to the friend who had been his assignment, polite and perfectly neutral, an actor playing the part of a companion while his eyes lingered where they shouldn't. There was something private in that glance, a warmed fold of expression that the crowd wouldn't notice. That tilt, so tiny, was the beginning of a thread that would knot both our lives together. By the time the night ended, I convinced myself I was imagining more than I remembered. He had saved a napkin for me with his sleeve, a practical, near-invisible kindness. Later, as Lee tugged me to an after-party and everyone dissected anecdotes, I caught a reflection of him near the window. Immaculate, composed, watching the city like someone who measured distance between people more than closeness. There was something private in that glance, a warmed fold of expression that the crowd wouldn't notice. That tilt, so tiny, was the beginning of a thread that would knot both our lives together. By the time the night ended, I convinced myself I was imagining more than I remembered. He had saved a napkin for me with his sleeve, a practical, near-invisible kindness. Later, as Lee tugged me to an after-party and everyone dissected anecdotes, I caught a reflection of him near the window. Immaculate, composed, watching the city like someone who measured distance between people more than closeness. A week later, I found a small parcel left at the studio where I taught calligraphy workshops to earn a few extra yuan. It contained a dress, simple but tailored as if the seamstress knew my shoulders, the way collars should sit. There was a note tucked underneath the hem, only 3 words, "For when you forget." I laughed then, the sound threaded with a new kind of ridiculous gratitude. Who bought a dress for a student? Who noticed in a world that rarely paused? It would have been easy to let the gifts be the beginning of a story I did not want. But I am not one for fantasies without work behind them. I teach kids in an after-school program, and I know the difference between gifts and responsibility. I replied with a token of my own, a small calligraphy bookmark I left in a nearby café with a flourish and a misplaced hope that he would find it. The bookmark had my name on it, written in a hand that made the ink swallow the page in a way that was unapologetically me. It was in the middle of an exam season that he stepped into my life again, this time with a resolve that surprised me. I had been late for a tutorial, the subway half empty, the night cold enough to pin breath to the windows. Someone tacked my sleeve with the gentle firmness of a person delivering mail, an intervention that felt both invasive and necessary. He handed me a paper cup with a lid and the kind of soup that asks you to take careful, thankful sips. I wanted to decline, to assert my independence. Instead, I accepted, because kindness tasted safer than pride. "Eat," he said, the single word simple but not brusque. He was colder in public, certainly. The press would call him composed. The boardroom would call him efficient. At a charity gala 3 weeks later, he stood by the stage as an iceberg in tuxedo, hands folded, conversation minimal. Cameras loved the mystique. Yet after the speeches were over and the lights grew polite and dim, he walked across the carpet to the coat check with a softness I hadn't expected, and returned with one of the volunteer scarves, which he slipped around my shoulders as if keeping me from the draft were the most logical of acts. His gesture was small and careful, hands ungloved, wristwatch catching the light like a reminder that time matters. I saw him in 2 guises. In public, a cut stone of a man who answered reporters with a thin smile, and in private, someone who left soup on my doorstep, who tightened the scarf knot when I shivered. Those slivers of tenderness intruded into my otherwise reasonable life and made room for a thought I hadn't planned to entertain, that he had seen me before I'd seen him, that his interest had roots more complex than curiosity. Campus gossip is like a weed. It blooms with persistent little flowers. Someone took a photo of us at the charity gala, an unguarded angle, me half-turned, my scarf thrown over my shoulders, then uploaded it with a caption thick with speculation. Threads spun out. Was the cold CEO dating a student? Did that arrogant, untouchable composition have cracks? Tong, the university's unofficial dramatist and a dancer with a knack for loud opinions, mocked the idea on stage during a student symposium, making the crowd laugh as if to diffuse the awkwardness. He said my name with an exaggerated bow. "Watch out, everyone! Shajicha is under new management." Between these public jabs and private kindnesses, a net of attention tightened. I sometimes found myself avoiding campus spots where his face might cross mine. At other times, I sought him out, because there are truths, the kind scribes record in thick ink, that you only discover when you see them in the flesh. Did he like me because I was who I am, or because I was a quaint deviation from the polished mosaic of his life? I could not tell, but I did not want to invent certainty where there was none. In the quiet hours, when the city hummed softer and I practiced strokes on rice paper, my mind wandered to old correspondences. I had an online friend, Gao Yu Yang, who had been the safe harbor of late-night messages when loneliness got too loud. He sent supportive texts, liked my posts, sent virtual bouquets of encouragement, and although his voice felt familiar, it lacked the gravity of in-person steadiness. We had been together in a way that required little more than mutual curiosity and convenience. He was a shelter, not a foundation. Fu's presence complicated that. I could feel the old currents shifting. Choices I had thought resolved came back like echoes in a hollow room. Gao Yu's messages assumed I was the same after each time, but I was not. I began to notice the way Fu's silence around me said something different than Gao Yu's messages ever had. There was weight in the quiet, a calibration I couldn't name. One autumn afternoon, Li burst into our cramped apartment with the news that would change the rules. She had a grin like fireworks. "He wants to talk," she announced, on the roof, in private, for 3 months. I stared at her, not understanding. 3 months of what? She fumbled the words like someone trying to untie a knot. "He wants a trial, private, no headlines. He says he'll test the possibility. It sounds like executive speak for date without social media, but the man said 3 months like he was listing stock options. It was absurd and terribly practical all at once. I imagined a contract with a clause about punctuality and a VAT applied to affection. But then I tried to picture him asking me in his composed way, and something in my chest responded like a bell. We went to the roof because it was the only place on campus where the air ran clean and the skyline gave the illusion of something wider than our tiny lives. He was already there, hands in his pockets, looking out at a horizon that seemed to belong to no one. The sky was the color of cheap ink. "You don't have to do this," he said when I sat down, voice even. This is awkward. For both of us. I can resume being a rumor. I wanted to laugh and tell him he had been the rumor since the night we'd met, that I'd preferred that kind of mystery to the loud kind. Instead, I looked at him. There was an honesty in his manner that made it difficult to reply with sarcasm. He had the distance of someone who measured risk as if it were something to be mitigated, like insurance policies or stone thresholds. 3 months of privacy, he continued. No announcements, no public displays. We see each other when it's reasonable. If we decide after that... He hesitated, blinked once, and it was visible then, a crack of uncertainty, a blip of something human. If we decide after that we want to be more, we'll figure out how to face the world. If not, we end with no fuss. He framed it as a business proposition. Perhaps that was a habit of people whose lives were managed like portfolios. The proposal had a logic that appealed to cautious parts of me. It also smacked of protection, his, like a hedge around my ordinary life. I had always been quick to reject anything that threatened to make me smaller, to turn me into a cautionary tale of poverty rescued by privilege. My mother had taught me how to accept help without losing pride, how to prefer dignity over spectacle. I thought about rent due in 2 weeks, about new brushes that wouldn't wait, about a body that wanted to be respected rather than patronized. "Why 3 months?" I asked, because curiosity felt like a safer weapon than fear. He gave me an answer that was not rehearsed, because 3 months is long enough to see patterns, short enough to be honest. Time is a good test of attention. There was no romance in the phrase, no grand promises, no cinematic circumference. There was only careful measurement, an attempt to keep the world at bay. I considered the alternatives, letting him walk away, letting rumor become a hollow legend, letting my life be a string of anonymous moments, and decided I wanted to know what would happen if someone who wasn't my family offered steadiness that required nothing of me but presence. "Okay," I said, 3 months. We shook on it like 2 people signing an agreement, palms warm and oddly formal. Lee cheered in the stairwell as if we'd declared a merger. It felt ridiculous to formalize something so tender, but perhaps that was what the 2 of us needed, a structure that allowed gentleness without spectacle. That first week of our privacy experiment was a study in smallnesses. He would appear in places I frequented, never announced, and leave like a bookmark between chapters. Once, he slipped a sweater in my locker because the forecast promised rain. Once, he stopped by the bookstore where I worked a Saturday shift and purchased old editions of poems I mentioned in a careless conversation weeks before. He had memory like a careful archivist. One evening, I fell ill with a fever, my body folding under the weight of exams and late nights. I dragged myself to bed and woke to the smell of broth. He was in my kitchen, not as the storming rescuer of melodrama, but as someone who had learned the algorithm of my cough and fever. He sat on a chair by the stove, eyes soft. "You should drink slowly," he said. It was not a command, it was an invitation to be cared for. I wanted to protest. Instead, I watched him fold his hands around the cup as if he'd been trained in small duties. There was no fanfare, no one to take selfies, no ledger of expense, just a quiet ache of attention. In that room, with broth fogging the air and the city muffled beyond the curtains, he was not the man whose headlines called him cold. He was someone who could hold a pot without letting it burn. But every private kindness came with its public shadow. The campus forum noted increased sightings, like a tracker marking coordinates. Messages arrived, some cute, some invasive. Hints of envy threaded the comments. Tong, the dancer, staged one of his more elaborate jibes during a student art showcase. He mimed bending a ruler and snapping it to illustrate how corporate constraints might crush student spirit. Laughter spilled around the room, brittle as cracked porcelain. The tension of being two halves, one in the spotlight, one in the quiet, settled on my shoulders like a new scarf. I learned to be vigilant with my privacy while allowing myself to be seen in micro-moments where his attention made me feel less small and more real. I was learning a dangerous art, trusting a person whose public persona carried its own gravity. One afternoon, as dusk turned the campus into a dim painting, he surprised me by asking to see something that mattered to me. "Show me your work," he said. The request was simple and ordinary and heavy with possibility. We walked to the old practice hall where I rehearsed strokes on paper stretched across low tables. He stood at the threshold, hands tucked into his coat pockets, looking like a man who had traveled far to understand a small thing. I laid a sheet out and began to write, slowly, the brush drinking the ink, the tip breathing. Calligraphy is a conversation between wrist and thought. It asks you to reveal a rhythm. He watched, not making noise, not asking questions. When I finished, he walked closer. The closeness did not embarrass me. It felt natural, like water finding a canal. "You write like you keep secrets," he observed quietly. "Not because you hide them, but because you choose who to tell." The comment was disarming. I could have said it was a data point, an insight gathered from observing someone quietly. Instead, I told him something true, unspooled without drama. I learned to write for my mother, for the letter she kept folded in her drawer. Writing was my way of sending her home in strokes. He read the characters with a silence that tasted like respect, and then, as if reaching the end of a long manuscript, he nodded once. "I'll help guard those letters," he said. It was a small sentence, but underlined with a promise he did not fully understand how to make. The word help refused to solve my problems with money or with the small, grinding edges of student life. It offered instead a steadiness that might make the burden lighter. That was different from rescues or spectacles. It was not a fixer's approach. It was companionship without overhaul. We adapted to the rules of our 3-month pact like dancers learning a new choreography. We met in places that felt safe, held our evenings like secret gardens. Our conversations were wary at first, small talk about logistics, the weather, the shapes of minor anxieties. Slowly, we unbuttoned more. Memories, small humiliations, childhood preferences. We shared milk tea at midnight after a gallery opening where my prints were displayed. The cup between us warmed our hands like a truce. A motif crept into our months, scarves and strings, letters and ink. He began leaving little tokens that made sense within the private grammar we were building. A keychain carved with a tiny seal that matched the flourish on my bookmarks. A knitted scarf that smelled faintly of cedar and the polish of a man who did not usually knit but had learned the motion for my sake. In return, I gave him small things. A calligraphy piece that said "patient" in a forceful feminine hand. A ticket stub from a play I loved. These exchanges were not grand. They were translations of attention. There were moments when his public mask snapped on like armor. At a board meeting, I once watched him from the lobby through tinted glass as he answered a reporter with an expression so controlled it sent a chill through me. In that sphere, he was practiced in deflection, skilled in turning questions into statements that resembled stone. I observed from a distance and felt an ache that had little to do with romance and everything to do with the way people hide their softness. But then there were the nights when he would come to a calligraphy exhibit and stand in the back while I performed a piece, eyes fixed like a lighthouse. At the end, when the applause died and light softened, he clapped, quiet, sincere, and his hands found mine as we walked out. Those are the moments that got stored in me like small treasures, tokens more valuable than the gossip threaded around us. Our arrangement fit into a pattern, until one evening when a message blinked across my phone with a tone that did not belong to friendship. It was anonymous, no name, only 3 words. She is mine. I read it twice, heart thundering against my ribs, and then again because words have a way of losing their meaning when fear arrives. Someone else wanted the story to be a possession. The message had the effect of turning private into precarious.
It was an omen shot through with entitlement, the kind that would not be appeased by kindness or careful contracts. I told Lee first because she has the ability to compute outrage into action. She vowed to find the account, to drag it into the light. I told Gayu next, not because I needed his help, but because he deserved honesty. He replied with a string of exclamation marks and "Are you okay?" that refused to sit elegantly between us. And then, finally, I told him. He listened, expression blank for a long moment. Then he stood up and walked to the window, hands clasped behind his back like a man weighing options. "Did you save the message?" he asked. Yes, my answer trembled with an edge of needless guilt. I did. He turned to me then, eyes tired only in the way that canyons look tired, deep, carved by years. "We don't involve cameras," he said. "We deal with it quietly. I will handle the source." "I don't want trouble," I said. It was honest. I feared the exposure more than the threat. I feared to become a headline, a curiosity. I feared losing the dignity of choosing life on my own terms. He closed the distance between us in 2 strides and sat on the edge of the couch, near enough that the room shrank to the span of our conversation. "Neither do I," he murmured. "We will be careful." That was the last of the small, cozy days before the world tilted. It was in the interim between a private pact and a public rumor that I felt the gravity of what we'd promised. 3 months is a peculiar measure. It allows space for attunement, but invites the scrutiny of those who would rather stories be louder than they are. We moved forward with the arrangement, each day a stitch in a cloth that might fray. He kept his public distance at events, press conferences, board dinners, holding his persona like an ornate garment. Yet in quieter moments, in the spaces between obligations, his gestures folded into mine like a secret language. He learned my favorite tea, the way I hold a brush, the small stories I told when I felt braver. I, in turn, learned how he measured the world, by numbers and risk and consequence, and how, under that calculus, he still made space for acts that were simply humane. One winter night, when the city was expecting its first snow, an email arrived that forced us into the open, clumsy, inevitable, an invitation with a press photographer's interest boldly implied. The campus was hosting a charity gala in partnership with businesses, and his family's foundation was on the list of sponsors. Someone on the organizing committee made a choice they would later regret: to pair public figures with students in order to draw attention to the event. It felt like a trap. It felt like an exposure. We had agreed to privacy, and yet institutions are unsentimental. They make their own decisions without asking 2 people in the middle of a careful negotiation. I sat on my bed and watched the snow begin to sift from the sky in small, obedient flakes, thinking of the way my life had adjusted around a scarf and broth and an unnamed kindness. I thought of the anonymous message again, and of how small meanness could turn into something worse if not confronted. He asked me to go with him to the event, quietly, with an agreement to stick to the edge of the crowd. He would be there publicly, composed as ever, and I would be his private accompaniment, something to make the evening feel less like performance and more like company. Neither of us liked the optics, but both of us understood that sometimes the only way to maintain a private circle is to be present in public and show that it need not be violent. Outside, the city smelled like wet stone. Inside, the gala hummed like a nervous animal, polite arrangements of people and press. When he stood behind the podium to deliver a short speech, the cameras did their job and the room filled with light. His face was sculpted with resolve, his words precise and cool. He made a sentence about community and responsibility, and no one could say he lied. He was perfect in that moment at his job. Afterwards, as we walked through a corridor lined with curtains and lights, I felt the cameras like a static sound in the air. Someone reached for a photograph, flash firing like a stutter. For a single second, my private life was public property, exposed to speculation and hungry eyes. When we stepped out into the cold, the snow caught on his shoulders like powdered sugar. He wrapped his arm around my shoulders, not possessively, but in a way that kept the press at bay. The gesture was both banal and intimate. I felt the warmth of his coat against my back, and the muffled thud of my heart like a private instrument playing a loud, honest tune. We walked without speaking, footprints making a private history in the white. Under the streetlight, he paused and drew me close. The kiss, when he asked for it, asked like a man who respected consent and knew how to be patient, was a hush, not a demand. It felt like the binding of two small promises, to keep the other safe and to admit the danger of wanting. I consented because I wanted to, because the 3 months had become less an experiment and more an apprenticeship in gentleness. The moment was not cinematic. It was ordinary and experienced like the soft press of winter on the skin. We lingered there, two people who had stitched a private life out of public cotton. When we pulled apart, there was a tremor between us, not the tremor of uncertainty, but the one that comes right before weather changes. A message blinked on my phone, then another. I checked and my stomach dropped. Someone had posted a photo of us, an angle that made us look as if we'd been caught in an intimate scene instead of an agreement kept deliberately discreet. The caption asked the question the world loves: is the cold CEO finally melting? I turned to him and saw, for the first time in weeks, the shadow behind his made-for-public face. He was not angry. He was calculating, like a man who drafted paths in his mind. "We need to decide how visible we are," he said quietly. I realized then that the experiment had shifted without our permission. What we planned to protect was now threatened by other people's appetite for stories. The 3 months had begun to look less like a private trial and more like a countdown between me and a public spectacle that would not respect boundaries. This was where the first part of our story tightened into a cliff, where gestures pooled into decisions, and where the warmth of a knitted scarf might not be enough to keep out the cold that comes from the world wanting, always, to know and own. I folded the scarf into my hands again, feeling the stitches, and wondered what it would take to keep the small things we treasured from being turned into headlines. If you're the sort of person who melts at a meet-cute, where a cold CEO's composure meets a student's stubborn, ink-stained hands, stay with me. This next part is where kindness and trouble both begin to make demands. The photo that made us headline poetry had barely cooled when the first legal notice arrived. It was the kind of official envelope that smells like someone else's authority. Terse language, a demand for removal, an accusation couched as protection. Someone had posted a clearer, more invasive picture of me, this one taken closer, captioned in a way that left no room for ambiguity. The forum thread swelled like a river behind a breached dam. Comments screamed for close-ups, for gossip, for identification. The anonymous messages multiplied. "She is mine. Keep her for me." A cascade of entitlement disguised as affection. That evening, Lee turned the apartment into mission control. She was furious in a way I'd learned to respect. Anger focused her like sunlight through a magnifying glass. She traced the accounts, flagged IPs, sent screenshots to campus security. Gayu messaged a string of exclamation marks that turned into a steady line of support. Offers to picket, to screenshot, to stand in the stairwell and shout until someone listened. I wanted none of that. My life was a series of measured strokes and small economies, ink, rent, tutoring hours. I did not want my face to be a currency in someone else's ledger.
So I told Fu plainly, in a way that felt like setting a boundary. I don't want headlines, I said. I want to keep this from being other people's entertainment. He heard the word other. He answered like someone who weighed consequence against principle. We'll deal with it, he said. He chose his words like someone placing stones to form a path. Slow, deliberate, necessary. I will find the source, quietly. There is a neat half-truth that rich people believe about power, that it can fix everything if applied in sufficient quantity. I knew better.
But I also knew there was a difference between someone who would deploy capital to erase a problem and someone who would put structure, law, counsel, presence around a woman's right to live without fear. He did not send a fleet of lawyers the first night. He stood at my door, hands in his pockets, and asked what I wanted done. It was the posture of someone who had learned to listen before deciding. We agreed on small steps, a police report, secure locks installed on my studio, a change of routine on campus. He said he'd speak with his team about tracking the accounts, not to erase the story, but to expose the person who thought they could own me with a screen. I won't make this theatrical, he promised. I'll make it thorough. For a week, everything folded into a careful choreography. Our 3-month experiment had become a shield as much as a contract. He still showed tenderness in small rituals. One afternoon, after I'd stayed too late at the studio and missed the last bus, I found a thermos on the doorstep. Inside was milk tea, warm and spiced with the same brown sugar I favored, and a note, "Eat and don't stay up too late." He had labeled it in blocky handwriting that tried to pass for neutral, but failed because tenderness is never neutral. I drank from it in the stairwell, watching my breath fog the glass, grateful for the small, steady proof that someone had chosen to look after me. The first violent interruption arrived like a cheap knockoff of a film scene, blunt, dangerous, and easily avoidable if the world were kinder. Lu Mingjia, the heir with a surname loud enough to be recognized in the town square, began appearing in places he had no reason to be. He liked to parade entitlement like a badge. At first it was a smirk at a gallery opening, then a curt comment at a student symposium. Tong used him as material for jokes. Lu returned jests with a stare meant to belong to someone else. When Luke Mingjia followed me out of a workshop one evening, the air carrying the smell of ink and rain, I felt that old smallness creep back again. "Leave me alone," I told him when he stepped a beat too close on the stairwell. His smile was that practiced kind, courtesy wrapped in cruelty. "You should know your place," he said, voice low and intended not to carry. It landed like a stone. I could have left. I might have marched to campus security. But there is a stubborn, almost perverse pride in not being reduced to fear. I worth the risk of wrong? Maybe not. Yet I pulled my bag closer and started down the stairs. He followed. The shove that came next was not cinematic. It was a quickness born of someone used to making demands with their hands. He brushed my shoulder with the side of his palm, intended to intimidate, and I turned, grip tightening on my bag strap. "What are you doing?" I asked. He reached for my scarf. My own, the cheap one I'd been wearing before Fu's knitted gift came into rotation. And there was a hand at the back of my neck that did not belong to me. I saw red then, the kind that arrives when fear sharpens into clarity. I shoved backward. My foot found nothing. I went down and hit the steps hard enough to knock the wind out of me. The sound of bodies, of night, of a city that is never fully asleep, crowded around the moment. Fu arrived like a solution no one asked for and everyone needs. He didn't punch or shout. He simply stepped in, 2 strides nullifying space, and positioned himself between Lu and me, hands flat and steady on Lu's chest. There was a traffic of people above the stairwell, someone with a phone filming, faces interested and hungry, and Lu's arrogance turned to irritation. "No more," Fu said. His voice was low, company-hardened, a blade wrapped in velvet. "Back away." Lu froze, more in irritation than fear.
He laughed, too loud, artificial, and pushed at Fu with a wristful of entitlement. The shove was clumsy, a man testing force against another man who had less spectacle and more consequence. Fu did not answer with equal and opposite brutality. He used his weight and a careful hold to pin Lu's shoulder, to create a boundary. He called campus security with a twist of authority that smelled like the boardroom. Guards arrived. A tape of the stairwell would later surface in evidence. Lu was escorted away, sulking, his friends muttering. There was no triumphant gladiator moment. There was only the dull aftermath. Me on the cold steps, my wrist scraped, my ankle smarting. My scarf twisted into my hair like a small, tender coda. Fu sat on the stair above me, knees close, hands steady. He watched my face as if cataloging the way I breathed. "Are you okay?" he asked. I lied, briefly. I said I was fine, because part of me was stubborn and didn't want to be spent. He let me lie for a beat, and then peeled back the edges until honesty came. He cleaned my hand with a packet of antiseptic he seemed to always have. The antiseptic smell joined the night like a small spell. He had never been the kind of man who performed rescue for applause. He performed rescue because he could not abide small injustices. We did the thing adults in these stories are meant to do. He insisted we go to the hospital to have my ankle checked, to have the scrape stitched. I argued about cost and dignity. He insisted in a way that made arguing pointless. It was less an order than a parental trait, a steady, immovable will aimed not to dominate but to secure. At the emergency room, while the nurse cleaned the wound and wrapped my ankle in a bulky bandage, he sat with his hand a respectful distance away from mine on the plastic chair, a cold, public face softened by the hum of hospital fluorescence. He spoke quietly with the doctor, asked practical questions, and later apologized for the world that allowed someone else's sense of entitlement to create harm. There were consequences. Lu Mingjia received a charge for harassment and unlawful restraint. Frustration and pride do not exempt you from law, the officers said, and it felt like a small, sturdy justice. He lost a scholarship committee endorsement as alumni began to murmur about his temper. Rumors mutated into evidence, and evidence into small punitive acts. He did not disappear. He sulked like someone whose toys had been taken away. But the legal action also created a new kind of noise. The forum that had once buzzed with gossip now traded in clickbait about "Why do billionaires have complicated neighbors?" and "The scandal no one sees." Social media thrummed. Some people cheered. Others accused me of playing the victim to gain fame. Others invented motives. My life became pages cut and pasted for strangers' appetites. Through it all, Fu held a demeanor practiced enough to be impenetrable in public and tender enough to be worrying in private. At a shareholders' meeting a week after the stairwell incident, he answered questions with dispassionate clarity, his face a mask of cool competence. The cameras loved him because he was predictable, crisp suits, crisp sentences. His public coldness became a brand asset, detached, efficient, a man who would not be undone by a scandal. I watched him from the audience of our small private world and felt the two notes of his life, public as glacier, private as hearth. At home that night he took my hand when no one watched. "You should file for an order of protection," he said. "The police will help. I will be there." I bristled at the idea that I was fragile enough to need saving. "I can do this," I said. "I can—" "You can," he said, "and you don't have to do it alone." That was the difference. He never positioned himself as a fixer of everything. He offered a presence that did not extinguish my agency. He helped me draft the report. He sat in the meetings with the campus counselor. He stood at the periphery while I chose my own statements. It was a partnership in the literal sense. Two people functioning in complementary ways without one becoming the other's replacement. But the world likes drama more than nuance. The police report leaked. An account credited to a close source posted a partial transcript of my statement, twisted for effect. The press savored the friction. A poor student accused of manufacturing attention. A cold CEO accused of playing savior. The narrative split into two easy headlines and, like most reductive things, gained traction. In the middle of that noise, my mother called and asked if I was eating properly. Her voice trembled in the way that mothers' voices do, small tremors of worry that pull the heart like tide. I tried to reassure her without lying.
"I'm okay," I said, because what could I offer her but the truth plastered in as much calm as possible? Fu's family found friction on a different current. The older generation in his household had rules like stones, slow to shift, heavy when moved. An elder cousin's remark about bad publicity came to him wrapped in thin concern. Family meetings that had once been about numbers and expansions now carried subtext, alliances, inheritances, the readiness of a son to marry a certain kind of woman and not another. Step relations tightened. A stepmother's eyes said things her lips didn't. Pressure ratcheted up in quiet ways. Invitations rescinded, passive-aggressive reminders about duty. When the board of his family foundation suggested more careful partnerships, it read to me as a demand that the arrangement be easier to own. He told me some of it in fragments, texts that arrived at odd times with a single line of complaint, a photo posted without context. "They're concerned about optics," he admitted once, standing in the kitchen and watching me while my bandaged ankle rested on a rickety stool. He kept his voice even, but there was an undercurrent, a sense that his family wanted him to become not only a leader of companies, but a leader of tradition. He had his own reasons to be hesitant. The boardroom had not forgiven recklessness in the past. It was in the middle of these family storms that the funeral came, an event that would complicate everything. The person we buried was not a distant relative, but someone structurally close to Fu, his grandfather, a man whose public presence had been more patient than sharp, a figure that softened the family's edges. The death was not dramatic, it was quiet, a last breath that took the weight from a frail body. The funeral fell at the threshold of the new year, those two rituals colliding into a single, raw night. Grief and calendar both demand attention. One asks you to stop, the other asks you to begin again. The funeral exposed cracks in food that no boardroom could polish. In public, as usual, he was composed, pressed suit, correct words. He spoke at the small memorial with precision, memories folded into his sentences. But during the wake, in a room lit by cheap fluorescent lights and warm memories, he let himself crumble. I had never seen him do that. The man who stood steady for press executives now allowed his voice to break, his eyes wet. He excused himself into a corridor and slid down a wall, the veneer of control falling away like the outer layer of a shell. I found him there, hands fisted, a man who had always offered me the shield, now in need of a shelter. He told me about his grandfather's letters, handwritten, careful, filled with simple instructions about humility and hard work. He admitted to resentment he had carried for duties he did not choose and for a love he was taught to hide. For the first time, his shell showed a seam and a thread. "I don't want to be the man they expect me to be," he said, voice raw. "I'm tired of being an answer people put in a test. I want to be something else with you." I sat with him on the cool stone of the corridor floor and listened as he told me about a boy who had learned to measure feelings by how safe they made the family look. The grief that evening did its own work. It stripped his public mask enough that I could see the man who stitched scarves with a clumsy hand where he thought I wouldn't notice. It made his private tenderness not an aberration, but the thing that had been waiting under the armor. The new year that followed the funeral felt like an exhale. Snow began to fall in polite, soft flakes, each one a tiny exclamation of white against the city. We walked in it the next morning, our footprints a private language on the frozen pavement. He had a scarf around his neck. I wore the knitted one he had given me, its scent faint and cedar-like. We did not speak much. Sometimes the best language is a pair of boots on snow. But he stopped, turned to me, and took my hands in his. There was a letter in his palm, folded in a careful rectangle. My breath hitched because the paper had a familiar crease. It was the same shape as the bookmark I had left months before in a café on a whim. I had told no one about that bookmark, an act of private bravado, and yet here it was. as if he had taken a long detour to catch a single syllable I had thrown into the world. "I kept this," he said, "since the first night." It was less a confession and more a return. He had kept the bookmark because it carried my name in ink, a private thing students do to leave a mark. He had found it somewhere, an online auction, a street vendor, perhaps a message sent on a midnight whim, and he had kept it as one keeps a relic of a day that mattered. I unfolded the paper with fingers that betrayed me. Inside was the old letter I'd written in high school, a ridiculous, earnest thing about being brave, about staying, about a small hope that one day someone would see me for the steady thing I often felt like. It was the kind of letter you write to a future self or a future life. I had forgotten I'd ever folded it so precisely. And there was, tucked inside, another note in his handwriting. It was short. "I saw you before you knew how to expect to be seen." My chest tightened in a way that had less to do with romance and more to do with the fact that someone had held a version of me in their hands for months. He hadn't just been curious. He had been attentive enough to preserve something of mine as if it were a vessel. We stood in the snow, the world around us soft and muffled, and he told me, quietly, the full thing I had guessed all along. How when he'd first looked at me in that crowded café, something in him had shifted like a gear finding its teeth. "It was one look," he admitted, "but it was the kind of look that asked me to stay. Not to claim you, to stay." There is a difference between falling and being renewed by love. He fell at first sight, yes. There was a gravity in that moment that made time list. But then he stayed. That was the larger truth. He stayed through the stairwell shove and the hospital night. He stayed through legal forms and family coldness and social media's appetite. He stayed through my assertions of independence and my demand to be treated with dignity. The days that followed were not an erasure of problems. Lu Mingji's anger did not evaporate. His privileges had been pricked, and he reacted with the pettiness of someone whose world cannot be widened. The board meetings still included whispers. Some corners of social media plotted a narrative. Did she take advantage of him? Did he pay to be loved? But the legal system did what it could. There was a record now. There was also public curiosity, which shifted and recentered as all appetites do. It was not perfect. The world rarely is. There were private victories, small and stubborn. Fu helped me find a safer studio on the 3rd floor of a building with a landlord who liked artists. He introduced me, lightly, to a small gallery owner who appreciated calligraphy because it sometimes made the world slower. He did not buy the gallery. He did not throw money across the table. He suggested, facilitated, and then let me choose. That distinction mattered. It was a way of offering support without erasing my choices. In the quiet afternoons when snow melted into slush and campus life resumed an almost sleepy normal, I taught my workshop. Children laughed as their brush tips swallowed ink. An old woman in the neighborhood beamed when I gave her a small practice sheet. My life kept its delicate rhythms. Fu showed up sometimes, always at a respectful distance, watching me as if he were studying a poem. He would stand against a column, hands in pockets, a public man softened into a private witness. There were shared breakfasts where he came unannounced with soup, a quiet promise. And there were nights when he sat at my desk and tried, earnestly and clumsily, to hold the brush. He failed spectacularly the first time and then laughed, a sound we both needed. I taught him a simple stroke. His hand was like the rest of him, practiced in certain domains and startlingly new in others. One evening, as the 3-month mark approached, we sat on a rooftop again, this time not to sign a contract, but to face the kind of question that friendship and affection eventually create. Is this more than an experiment? The city beneath us hummed. Lights winked like patient stars. He looked at me with a tiredness that was different than before. Not the exhaustion of spectacle, but the fatigue of someone who decided not to be something preordained. I started this as an experiment, he said. I wanted to see if the two of us could exist without the world saying we could not. But experiments, they change the experimenter.
I smiled because his phrase, by accident, felt like a confession. And? I asked. And I don't want to test you anymore, he said simply. I thought about the many ways a person can be generous, and the many ways generosity can be used. I thought about independence and dignity, and the small bookmarks we tuck into life to remember the pages we have turned. I don't want to be rescued, I told him, but I also don't want to face everything alone. He put his hand over mine, a touch that had become language. Then let us be deliberate, he said. Deliberate felt like an improvement over experimentation. It also felt honest. Love that respects agency is not a lightning bolt that obliterates. It is a series of agreements between two people who choose each other repeatedly. The public reveal came not as a spectacle, but as a decision. We announced that our relationship existed on our own terms. Not a headline, not a charity photo, but an honest statement that two people had decided to face the world together. It was a controlled release, a few photos chosen with care, a short statement that read like an editorial about choice and privacy. The social media storm settled into a hum, as new appetites always do. Some people cheered, some mocked. Most moved on, because new things always arrive to distract. Lu Mingzhe sulked and then vanished from the headlines. He retained the kind of resentment that cannot be fully medicated by public censure, but consequences had a way of correcting the edges. The police ticket and legal restriction did the work the world would not have done by social shame alone. The discovery of the old letter had its small, sweet consequence. We read the words together that night by the light of a lamp, his hand occasionally brushing mine like a punctuation. I read the awkward adolescent promises I had once written, a vow to be brave, a vow to not let fear decide my path. I had forgotten those vows, but he had not. He told me he had kept the bookmark in his briefcase, among papers and a small carved seal that matched the keychain he'd left on my scarf. "You kept all of it?" I said, incredulous. "Because you were there," he replied, "even when you didn't know it." The months that followed were not a smooth arc into honeymoon ease. There were board meetings and articles. There were nights when he did the hard work of unlearning the impulse to control outcomes. And there were times when I had to remind him that my pride needed space. But we learned, daily, how to be company without becoming dependency. On a low-key evening near the year's first anniversary of our meeting, a date he had not dared claim as his to mark, but had nonetheless remembered, he presented me with a small knitted scarf. It was nothing like the first one, clumsy and handmade. This one was better shaped, somehow more true to the warmth it promised. He handed it to me with a look that asked permission. "This is for when the world gets loud," he said.
For when you need to remember that someone will be here to pass you warmth. I wrapped it around my neck. It smelled faintly of cedar and ink. It was not an erasure, it was an offering. "I'll wear it when I want to," I said. "Wear it when you want," he agreed. We did not stage a proposal, at least not the kind that is carefully planned with flash and an announcement. Instead, we built a life that suggested possibility. He found me a place with better light for my practice, offered to subsidize a scholarship for students who could not afford brushes, and taught the children in my after-school program to write their names in confident strokes. I refused to be bought into comfort. He refused to insist. We moved together in a way that honored both our pasts. The final scene of that first year with him was small. Snow, a scarf, a letter. We walked home after a small gallery opening where one of my calligraphy pieces had sold, a modest victory, but the mood was celebratory in the way quiet victories are. He stopped under a streetlight, knee-deep in powder, and took my hand. "Do you remember that night?" he asked, and I did. The milk tea spilling, the room narrowing to a face over a napkin, Lee's grin, the bookmark's quiet existence. "I do," I said, because remembering felt like a vow.
He reached into his pocket and pulled out a tiny keychain, the seal that had become a motif of our small exchange, and slipped it into my palm. "Keep it," he said, "not as a map, but as a thing that says you are seen." Snow fell then, soft, earnest, settling on our coats like small white promises. He leaned forward and kissed me then, not dramatic, not recorded, simply a press of lips that was mutual and careful and consented to by both. It was the kind of kiss that meant, we will try. When we pulled apart, he rested his forehead to mine for a second, and then whispered, half for me, half for the night, "Stay with me." I looked at him, the man whose public life read like an essay on restraint, whose private life had the messy, human marks of compassion, and I answered, with my hands still clutching the keychain and the scarf around my neck, "I will." We did not promise that problems would end. We only promised we would meet them together. That is the sort of promise you can build a life on, because it allows for agency, respect, and the work of love. If this quiet story warmed you, like and subscribe for more romantic dramas that take their time.